Hello, this is a video on Job, and I love the book of Job. I've always liked the book of Job, but it seems like every time I look at the book of Job, some deeper layer unfolds to it. And so I wanted to share some of my thoughts on Job. I don't think they're just my thoughts, but they also help, I think, place Job within the Old Testament. They give us a sense of what I call the flow of revelation. Now, you may not like that idea, and of course, I'm not trying to bully you into a particular perspective. This is what makes sense of all of the data. Trying to listen to the text, trying to let the text say what the text seems to say, and forming conclusions in the light of listening to all the other texts of the Old Testament. These are some of the thoughts that have come, and I want to make this point that a lot of us start off with what I might call, and I get this term from William Webb, a static understanding of the words of the Bible. This is a understanding of the Bible that really doesn't read the words against the background in which they were first written. So we kind of put all the words of the Bible into some sort of, we think, timeless bubble, and nothing ever moves. It all says the same thing. It all fits in a kind of non-contextual kind of way. But of course, if God wanted to be understood, he would have had to speak, to some extent at least, within the frameworks of the people he's speaking to. They're not going to understand him otherwise. And of course, it's a mistake to think that all humans in all time have thought the same way. If you have a little intercultural experience, you go maybe live in another country for a year and begin to understand that other people don't think the way that we think, that I'm not in a timeless bubble myself. That's the kind of the hidden secret to the static views. It assumes that I am in that timeless bubble as well. And so it makes much more sense to say that the Bible, and all revelation for that matter, is incarnated revelation. That is, that God meets us where we're at, within our paradigms, within our worldviews, within our framework, and he moves us in the right direction from there. Well, I've said this before probably. If you've walked along with me in a course, or are walking along with me in a course, but I want to share with you some perspectives on Job. Okay, I want to start with Job's comforters, so-called. They're not very comforting, really. What do they say? They say that Job has sinned. They have what I might call a Deuteronomistic perspective. And if you're following me along in an Old Testament, a survey of the Old Testament right now, you know that when I talk about a Deuteronomistic theology or a Deuteronomistic perspective, I'm basically talking about the point of view that we find in Deuteronomy 28 and 29. Now, the perspective in Deuteronomy 28 and 29 is true, of course, but it's a very broad stroke. What does it say? It says that if you serve me, I will bless you. If you don't serve me, I will curse you. And that's true, okay? Because there's heaven and hell and so forth. However, in the mind of Deuteronomy, that is pretty well dispensed within this life. Deuteronomy doesn't express any real sense of reward or punishment after death. Deuteronomy doesn't really talk about the afterlife in terms of a personal, meaningful life after death. Deuteronomy, what it talks about is punishment either to you in this life or to your children or grandchildren. The sins of the fathers are visited to the sons into the third and fourth generation, and so forth. And so the basic starting point theology of Deuteronomy, which by the way is expressed in the book of Joshua and in Judges and in Samuel and in Kings and so forth, is that you serve me, you're blessed. You don't serve me, you're cursed. And that's true. However, there are complications. We know Deuteronomy does not express these complications. Complications like, well, sometimes the good Why do the good die young? Sometimes the righteous die, and sometimes the wicked live long and prosperous lives. The worst king of Judah, the worst, according to the book of Kings, was Manasseh. Manasseh died a long life, a prosperous reign, died peacefully in his bed. Josiah, according to Kings, I think portrayed as the most righteous king of all, dies in battle prematurely. And so that doesn't, sometimes we don't get blessed in this life, and sometimes we get cursed in this life even when we are serving the Lord. And this is, of course, one of the points of the book of Job. The book of Job teaches that just because Job has experienced all these calamities doesn't mean that he's unrighteous. You see, Job's comforters don't see that. They only have this limited perspective that you serve God, you get blessed. You don't serve God, you get cursed. And so they have the perspective of the disciples in John 9. Well, Jesus, who sinned? Was it this blind man or his parents? Again, even that much hundreds of years later, the disciples think, he's blind. Somebody did something wrong. Or in the book of Joshua, they lose in battle against Ai. Somebody must have sinned. Now, again, in broad strokes, less precise strokes, that's true. The righteous prosper, at least in eternity. The wicked are cursed, at least in eternity. However, we know from like Isaiah 53, surely he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. I have a cross behind me here. Jesus is the consummate example about how not all suffering is because you have been disobedient. But so Job's comforters have a very entry-level understanding of how this works. They bring the perspective of Deuteronomy, and they therefore infer Job must have sinned because he's not suffering. And denial's not just a river in Egypt. What have you done, Job? You know you've done something wrong. What is it? Fess up. And of course, Job doesn't. Job is quite adamant. I have not sinned to bring this on. Okay, we also have an incomplete perspective from Job's wife. In fact, we have pretty much an entirely wrong perspective from Job's wife. But here's an interesting thing that didn't dawn on me for years. Job's wife doesn't really know about heaven or hell either. You see, I thought, this is how I used to think. What a horrible woman. She tells Job, why don't you curse God and die? And I took that as her basically saying, why don't you curse God and go to hell? I mean, that's the way I used to interpret what she was saying. But she doesn't understand, in my opinion, she doesn't understand that there is a life after death. She's actually, in a twisted kind of way, being merciful. She's like, Job, why don't you curse God? He'll fry you and it'll all be over and you'll be out of your suffering. Not good advice, but she's at least trying to help. And this relates to another aspect of the flow of revelation in the Old Testament. Some call it progressive revelation, but some people don't like that term. I've called it the flow of revelation. And I talk about how the Old Testament starts off true, but less precise. And as we go through the Old Testament on some of these issues, the Old Testament gets more precise. And of course, then in Jesus, we have the final word. But Daniel 12 is the only, Daniel 12, 2 and 3 is the only passage in the Old Testament that everybody agrees is about resurrection. There are other passages that some say, well, I think this is talking about an afterlife. But by and large, the Old Testament is pretty silent when it comes to life after death. And so we can't fault Job's wife for not knowing that there is a heaven to gain and a hell to shun. She says, curse God and die because she wants him, basically to move on. I would argue that Job, so this is what she says. It's not Job 2:0 because there is no verse 0. I'm not sure what that is. And since it's bugging me, there it is. It's Job 2:9. Job actually doesn't understand about, I would argue, about life after death either. He says this, if a man dies, will he live again? And it's a question expecting the answer, no, of course he won't live again. You overpower a man once and for all, and he's gone. If his sons are honored, he does not see it. So Job doesn't seem to fully understand yet that there is a reward and a punishment after death. This is in keeping with most of the understanding of the Old Testament. Now, some of you, if you know Job well, you know there is a verse that Handel's Messiah certainly takes in terms of resurrection. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth, and so forth. And in my flesh I will see God. Now, I actually think that in context, what Job is saying is, I think God's going to fix this before I die. I think God is going to come and he is going to heal these boils, and that I'm going to have my flesh restored even before I pass from this life. So to me, this is an example of how when we have the later glasses of the New Testament on, we read verses in a certain way that is not the way that the original audiences of Job would have heard it. By the way, the New Testament does not quote that verse either in relation to Jesus. That's a kind of a later understanding. I have no problem with reading it that way with spiritual glasses on. I'm just saying I don't think that's the way Job understood those particular words. Some people disagree. But so here is an example again of how, as we move through the Bible, lights go on and we learn more and more, and the revelation gets more and more precise. At least that's my perspective after trying to fit all these pieces together. I could, of course, be wrong, but that's something to consider. So what is Job's perspective? Here's interesting here. When Job loses all of his children and his wealth and all that, he says, I came into the world naked. I'll go out of the world naked. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is, of course, the right attitude. This is a wonderful humility, submission to the Lord. This is great, absolutely wonderful. Now, here's the thing. The Lord does give and the Lord does take away. And the Lord is sovereign. That is, the Lord is in control. Nothing happens in this world without the Lord signing off on it. Okay? So this is a true statement. I want to point out something. This was fascinating to me once upon a time. Have you ever compared 2 Samuel 24:1 with 1 Chronicles 21:1? So 2 Samuel is a couple hundred years maybe earlier than Chronicles. So we're getting an earlier perspective. Samuel is before Israel went into exile, or Judah went into exile. Chronicles is after. Okay, so here is 2 Samuel 24:1. The Lord put it into the heart of David to number the children of Israel. Now, what we find is this is not a good thing. In fact, when David does it, he sins, and he's punished. Israel's punished for David's sin, and so this is like does not compute, because there's a verse in James 1, right, that says, let no one say when they are tempted that they are tempted by the Lord, because the Lord doesn't tempt anyone. That's what James 1 says in the New Testament. So it's kind of like, what's going on here? Because the Lord seems to be causing David to sin. Well, just to make things even more interesting, let's look at the version of this in 1 Chronicles. Satan put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. What's going on here? One passage, this is the same event. Samuel says God did something that Chronicles says Satan did. What's going on here? Well, this is my hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that while Israel was in captivity, and probably particularly when the Persians became an influence, that God turned on the light with regard to Satan. There is, let me go ahead here. Let me blah, blah. Oh, okay. This is the slide. Have you ever noticed that in the book of Job, Job never finds out about this wager between God and Satan? In case you haven't read Job lately, the sons of God, the angels, they come in before God to report, and Satan is with them. And Satan, he kind of comes across as a product tester. He goes around kicking tires, to see if they're going to hold up. And so God kind of taunts Satan. He says, have you considered my servant Job? You can't get him to sin, can you? And of course, this ticks Satan off. And Satan's like, well, you blessed him. Of course, he's not going to sin. I mean, he's got all this blessing and wealth and everything. And so God allows Satan, the operative term, God allows Satan to take it all away. And then, of course, Satan comes back. Have you considered my servant Job? And Satan's like, well, of course, I haven't touched his body. If I touch his body, he'll be a mess and he'll curse you. And of course, God says, okay, I'll allow you to do it. One thing is interesting is that Job never finds out. God doesn't tell Job about this. There's more going on in the spiritual realm than Job knows about. And there's a lesson for us here, because there's always a whole lot more going on in the spiritual realm than we know about. We wonder, why am I suffering? Why am I going through this? Why did the Lord allow this to happen? We have to realize that there's a whole lot more going on than our little pea brains can possibly understand. Now, see, Satan is only mentioned in 3 books of the Old Testament, and all 3 of them, I would argue, are after the exile. So Genesis, this is interesting, Genesis only speaks of the serpent. The book of Genesis itself never mentions Satan. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe that the serpent was Satan, but that's only in hindsight. The book of Genesis doesn't seem to know anything about Satan. In fact, and this is striking, there is no mention of the serpent being Satan until the century before Jesus, hundreds and hundreds of years after every single book of the Old Testament was written. In fact, there is a book written in 150 BC called the Book of Jubilees. It was probably scripture for a Jewish group called the Essenes. Book of Jubilees goes through Genesis and expands upon it. But here's the thing. Even the Book of Jubilees doesn't seem to equate the serpent with Satan. Now, again, I believe the serpent was Satan. But what I'm getting at is that there was no concept of the Satan prior to the exile, is my thesis here. First Chronicles is clearly post-exilic. Maybe the late 400s, who knows, maybe even the early 300s BC. First Chronicles is late, and so it mentions Satan. Zechariah 3:1 and 2 is clearly written after the destruction of the temple, because Zechariah is one of the cheerleaders for the rebuilding of the temple. And so the only candidate for a pre-exilic writing would be Job. Now, you may have heard people always say, well, Job is the oldest book of the Old Testament written. This reflects, I think, a fundamental blind spot where we confuse what the book is about with who wrote it. I don't know why this is. It's a funny phenomenon to where, Joshua written by Joshua, Jonah written by Jonah. Why? It doesn't read that way at all. Joshua is entirely in the third person. Jonah is entirely in the third person. In fact, Moses is not even mentioned in the book of Genesis. And when Moses is mentioned in Exodus through Deuteronomy, it's always in the third person. Moses did this, Moses did that, Moses went up into a mountain and died. And so it's very interesting that I don't know what it is. I could write a book about Job. I could write about a book about George Washington, but that doesn't mean that I'm writing at the same time as George Washington. And so the content of Job may be very ancient indeed. That doesn't mean that it was written at that time. Anyway, so I would argue, and I'm not alone, that the book of Job probably did not reach its current form until after the exile. So Satan is not a concept that was known, in my opinion, prior to the exile. Why am I telling you this? Because prior to the exile, all causation is attributed directly to God. Now, is it true that God is in control of everything? Absolutely. And so it's true to say that God did this. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. That's true because the Lord signs off on everything. But we know from Job 1 and 2 that Satan was the direct person to do it. God allowed it. This is a distinction between what we call God's permissive will and God's directive will. God does not direct Satan to do these things to Job. God permits Satan to do these things. And so what we find is Job never even finds out in the book of Job that this is going on. And so Job, the book of Job here, or Job himself has a less precise understanding of what's going on than we do, arguably like the earlier part of the Old Testament. Have you ever noticed this verse in 1 Samuel? An evil spirit from God came on Saul. Really? God causes somebody to be demon possessed? That doesn't seem to fit with James 1, that God would send an evil spirit directly. I would guess that now Chronicles doesn't talk about this passage, but I bet that if Chronicles talked about this passage, it would say that Satan sent an evil spirit on Saul. Again, 1 Samuel 18 is not incorrect. It's just less precise, because all of the Old Testament prior to the exile attributes causation directly to God, whereas we know after the exile that Satan does some stuff too. By permission, the Lord allows it rather than by command. Here's another one. Who gave humans a mouth? Who makes a person deaf or mute? Who gives sight or blindness? Is it not I, says the Lord? Well, yes, the Lord signs off on all this. But with this understanding, we can know that there are sometimes other forces that are more directly involved in this sort of thing than just God directly commanding it. Again, this is my way of dealing with some of these passages that seem difficult. Why would God send an evil spirit on someone? Well, the book of Job ends with God's perspective. And let me introduce to you a concept in stories known as the evaluative perspective. So there are lots of different perspectives in Job, right? There are the comforters, Job's wife, there's Job, and then there's God. And so these are different perspectives. But the perspective that counts the most in Job is God's perspective when he comes in at the end, because the others, to varying degrees, are not correct. So Job's comforters are not correct. There's some truth to what they're saying, but they're not right on the key issue. Job's wife is not right on the key issue. Job even is not entirely correct, because Job thinks God just doesn't like me. I mean, God has it in for me, and God comes in and says, "You're wrong, Job. You don't know what's going on here." And so the evaluative perspective of a story is the perspective that tells us what we're supposed to think. And in the Bible, it's always God's perspective. God's perspective is always the perspective that tells us what we want to think. Now, of course, we have to remember that the book of Job itself is still in the flow of revelation as a writing. Remember, I said that Job doesn't necessarily seem to understand yet about the afterlife. And so the book of Job itself is in a flow of revelation, which is something to remember. But the bottom takeaway here is that the reasons for suffering are above our pay grade. We don't have this God's eye perspective of what's going on. We don't know what's going on in the spiritual realm. We know that God is righteous. We know that God is good. We know that God is just. We know that for sure. We know that God is in control. We know that God is sovereign. You may have heard of the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. It basically says if God is good, why he would want to stop evil. If God is all powerful, he can stop evil. Well, then why is there evil? Well, the answer is because we just don't understand the whole picture. That's the only answer that's possible. We just simply don't have a God's eye perspective to know why God allows some things and doesn't allow others. But it is helpful to me in this problem of suffering. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have this, that there's a difference between what God directly commands and with what God allows. And of course, God says, I love this line in Job 41, can you pluck Leviathan out of the sea with a fish hook? No, you can't. I can. What is Leviathan? Some sort of a sea creature of great force, I assume, here. There is some Ugaritic literature, which is a culture just before the Jewish culture, in which there's a god, a sea god named Lothan. So there may be some monster proportions involved here in what they thought Leviathan was. Well, That brings me to the end of my video. I hope this has been stimulating. I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm just on a journey with you, and wanted to share with you some of my reflections on the text of Job in the light of the rest of the Old Testament.